There's a really interesting verse in the Bible where Jesus refers to one of his good friends, John the Baptist, as the greatest man ever. And I think if being great was such a bad thing, I don't think Jesus would have ever referenced somebody in this way. But when you look at the life of John the Baptist, it actually makes sense. It wasn't the fact that John the Baptist was greater than Jesus, it was his attitude that was great. In fact, this whole song that we're singing, it's written from John 3:30. It says that he must become greater and I must become less. And church family, it's okay if you and I want to be great, but let's be great for the right reasons. Let's be great at making God the famous one in our lives. Let's be great at making Jesus even greater. Let's be great at laying down our struggles, the burdens, the things that hold us back, so we can experience the plans and purposes that God has for each and every one of us. And I want to take a moment today and I want to pray for our church family. I'm sure many of us walked in here today and we put a smile on our face, but really inside we're broken, we're hurting. Wherever you're at, if you just need prayer today, would you just boldly slip your hand up in the air? Because we as a church family want to pray for you. We want to ask God to move and work through your circumstances. In church, if you're standing next to somebody whose hand's lifted, I just want to encourage you to put a hand on their shoulder. Let's just ask God to move and to work through these circumstances. Would you join me? God, we come before you right now on a level playing field. Each and every one of us struggle. We hurt. Many of us today, God, who have our hands raised are just in need of some extra help in this season. For some of us, it just feels like there's just no way out of what we're going through. But God, we believe in your word. We believe that you know the plans, the future that you have for us. And so I just pray that right now we would experience your hope, your grace, and we would experience your healing. Lord, thank you for each and every one of us, our brothers and sisters who are here today. We surrender all to you, for it's in your name we pray. And every person says,
Amen.
They called him Jesus. He came to love. He meant forgive. He bled die to buy my pardon. Listen to this. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior. And then the following week, Easter Sunday, we're going to celebrate like crazy that the story didn't end there, that Jesus is alive. So I want to encourage you to be a part of that. But today we're kicking off our brand new series straight out of the 90s. You can be seated right now as Pastor Judd comes to share a message of hope with us today. Hey, and speaking of Pastor Judd, he hates introductions, but yesterday was his birthday, Central Family. So I want to the greatest senior pastor ever. Let's sing happy birthday to him. Come on. Happy birthday to you. Come on.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday.
Thank you. I'm feeling younger already. It's awesome. No, it's good to be another year older, and you know what? There's nowhere I'd rather be on my birthday weekend than right here with the Simple family, being able to share with you guys. Somebody asked me, like, how was your birthday last night? I said it was amazing. I got to preach on my birthday. It doesn't get any better than that, you know, like, not for me. So, anyway, glad you're here today. Hey, so we all have a different relationship with the 90s. Some of you were not even born in the 90s. How many of you were not yet born in the 90s? Okay, so for you, you speak of the 90s like the 1900s. That's what my daughter's like, oh, that's from the 90s. Like, that's the 1900s. You know, the horse and buggy and, you know, the whole deal right back then. How many of you were, born in the 90s? You're sort of 90s babies. Okay. So for you, like, you know, that was really formative, growing up kind of years. I'm not sure how much of it you remember, but I'm sure you remember, like, the Rugrats and the Magic School Bus, right? Remember that? Barney, some of you remember Barney, you know? And, oh yeah, here we go, the whole song, right? Okay, that's good. So how many of you were born, or how many of you were in middle school and high school in the 90s? Middle school, high school, all right. So for you, like, when you say the 90s, you're like, well, that was back in the day, right? Back in the day, the way we used to roll with our Doc Martens, you know, back in the 90s, listen to these things called CDs. Anyway, it's back in the day. How many of you were in your 20s in the 90s, in your 20s? Okay, so like for you guys, this is when you're adulting, right? Like you got to get a job, real responsibilities coming on now. It's like heating up, it's got stuff coming at you. How many of you were in your 30s or older in the 90s? 30s or older in the 90s? Yeah, so I think for you guys, well, it depends on where you're at. If you have little kids, and what you remember of the 90s is also Rugrats and the Magic School Bus and Barney, right? And just getting through that season. And then at the end of the 90s, there was Y2K. Anybody remember Y2K? You know, it was like the whole world was going to end because all the computer programs were ready to shift over to the year 2000, and, you know, and then nothing happened. So, there it is, you know. So anyway, the 90s were a lot of fun. You know, I got just some thoughts here on how you know if you rock the 90s. If you got some CDs that maybe were like this one right here, a little Nirvana. You remember that was big in the 90s back in the day, right? Okay, so that's good. Or, you know, depending on like the lane that you're in, maybe something like this, little Snoop Doggy Dogg back in the day, right? Which, by the way, Lori and I were driving to church this morning with my son in the back seat, and she's like, hey, let's put on the 90s, like, playlist, you know, like, play it on the radio, and Snoop Dogg came on, and it's like, oh, yeah, change that. Kids in the back. We need that. That was cool back then, but now we got a kid in the back seat, people. Put some gospel on. No, I'm kidding. If you understand this right here, then maybe you remember and rocked the 90s. America Online 4.0 with 100 free hours. This was how you got on the internet back in the 90s. You get one of these discs, remember, and you put it in, and you have to dial up and go through the whole deal, and then when you know, finally, like, you get to your email, right? If you got mail, you hear the little, you know, you've got mail, you know, sound, and amazing, right? Your email address was AOL.com. Listen, if your email address is still AOL.com, you may still be in the 90s. It's time to upgrade. One more thing, you know that you rock the 90s if you have one of these guys right here, you know, the brick phone. And I mean, you were big living if you had a phone like this. It was like $1 a minute to talk on this thing, right? You know, like, so you were this. Now, as the 90s went on, smaller phones came out, but decades sort of started, and people were still using these big, huge phones if you could afford them. A lot of great media, TV shows, movies in the 90s. One of my favorites was The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Anyone remember that show? So it's about this kid from the streets of Philadelphia that, like, moves to Bel-Air and is raised by his aunt and his uncle, and, you know, kind of navigating those dynamics. And it gave us a lot of things. You know, it gave us great stories. It gave us the theme song that you've already heard. It gave us the Carlton dance, but really it gave us Will Smith. Come on. This is where he started, right? And, you know, now he can buy whatever he wants in Bel-Air. And probably has, right? You know. So 90s was a lot of fun. Well, what we're going to do over the next several weeks, we're going to have some fun with the 90s, but we're also going to go look at some timeless stories in the Bible that are true for any decade. And we're going to look at some stories like next week we're going to talk about Samson and Delilah. Can't wait to do that. We're going to talk about Ruth and Naomi. These timeless classic stories that have a lot of insight for us in our lives. And today I want to talk to you about not the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but the Fresh Prince of Egypt, a guy named Moses. And I want to learn from Moses how we can face uncertainty in our lives. The 90s was an uncertain decade, and truthfully, any decade you live in has plenty of uncertainties. How many of you feel like you're facing some uncertainty right now in your life? Like you're not sure what's going to happen. You know, you're not sure if the Cowboys are going to get their draft pulled together before the season, right? You're not sure. There's uncertainty. Are the Knights going to, how far are they going to go? What's happening with the Knights? There's uncertainty. Will the Raiders win a game next year? There's all kinds of uncertainty out there in the air, right? We all face uncertainty in our lives. And then, of course, you read about things in the news, like this horrible shooting at the two mosques in New Zealand. You know, it heightens the sense of uncertainty in all of our hearts and lives. Where's the world going? What's happening in our world? Which, by the way, you know, our thoughts and prayers definitely are with those families and those individuals. And I just want to state, it doesn't matter what your religion is, you ought to be able to go to a place of worship and express that worship in safety. Hearts are heavy for those families. But you know, there's uncertainty. Uncertainty about where our country's going. Uncertainty, just the political commentary on either side. Lots of uncertainty that we live with. Maybe you've applied for college and you're waiting to hear back to see if you got in the school that you applied for. And you didn't bribe somebody for $500,000. So, uncertainty, right? True. So, we all face it. We all face uncertainty. And Moses gives us some insight, and his parents, on how to deal with uncertainty with faith. Again and again, Moses came to uncertainty, and again and again, he models for us what it means to step forward with faith. So let's check this out. Hebrews 11:23. We'll bring this up on the screens. I'll read this, like this is how we do it at Central. When we get to the highlighted word, I'll just ask you to read that word out loud with me. It's how we keep everybody awake around here. All right, here it is. Hebrews 11:23. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not what? Afraid to disobey the king's commands. So they were not afraid to disobey the king's commands. Now the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had issued a command, and the command was this, that all the baby Hebrew boys be thrown in the Nile and drowned. And the reason he issued that command is he was getting really concerned that the Hebrews, the slave population, was growing at such a rapid pace that eventually there were going to be so many of them, they were just going to overthrow the masters. Right? And so the Pharaoh comes along and says, well, here's what we're going to do. If she's a girl, the baby can live. If he's a boy, the baby dies. I mean, you think our politicians are bad. Right? It's a brutal time that they're living in. And the Bible tells us by faith, Moses' parents, they hid him for 3 months. They refused to obey the order of the king. And they were not afraid of ultimately what might happen. They hid him, they held on as long as they can, and then we read that they waterproofed a basket, and they put Moses in this basket, and they set the baby Moses in the Nile, and they pushed him down the river. So there's a couple things we can learn here. One is, through faith, they did everything they could do in their power, but there comes a place where our power comes to its limits, right? They hid him as long as they could, but then eventually they had to let him go and surrender him to God and entrust their baby to God. When you face uncertainty in your life, first challenge for you is this, to let go of your need to control everything. Let go of your need to control in your life. We all have a need to control. Remember my son, he was working on his computer. I walked in, I said, Ethan, what are you doing? He had his computer open, and I said, it's time to go to bed. You need to go brush your teeth and kind of get things ready. And he looked up at me with attitude, and he said, you're not the boss of me. And, the nuclear button went off inside me, right? I'm like, oh, whoa, what did you just say? He goes, you're not the boss of me. I said, listen, let me instruct you in the hierarchy of the universe. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, Dad. That's how it works right there. And as long as you're living under my roof, eating my food, sleeping in my bed, taking care of my stuff, like as long as you're living here, I'm the boss of you. You better believe it, dude. He looked at me and he says, you're not the boss of me. Mom's the boss of me, and the boss of you too. Right, I'm not just going to say that. I said, well, when I said me, I'm speaking of Mom and I as if we're one. Right? We all like to be the boss. No, we all like to be in control. We all like to have our hand on the wheel. And particularly when it comes to uncertainty in our life, that's part of what bothers us. We want to kind of have things mapped out. We want to have things figured out. And it's good to have a plan. And it's good to, to work the plan. Yes, there's a lot of things we can control in our lives, and we should control what we can control. But there are many things that are outside of our control, right? I mean, we all have kind of an illusion of control sometimes, that we're really the boss and the ultimate determiner of our destiny. But it only takes a few things to happen in your life for you to realize how much is actually out of your control, right? A health crisis, a car comes through a light, smashes into you out of nowhere. I mean, a family member goes through a crisis, a tragedy, and that bubble of the illusion of control gets popped. And you realize, yeah, there's a lot I can control, but there's a lot I can't control. Wisdom comes along when you're facing uncertainty and says, look, God, teach me the difference. Teach me to do the things that I can do, control what I can control, and give me the wisdom to then release the things I can't control and let those things go. Now, here's Moses' parents, and they're facing this horrible situation. This was not their plan. Some of you right now, you're in a place in your life where you're like, this is not my plan. This was not where I thought I would be. Never thought I'd be here. Never thought I'd be doing this. Never thought I'd be with the person I'm sitting beside. Like, this is not where I thought I'd be. Right? Don't laugh too loud at that. You're going to get in trouble. Moses come along, and Moses' parents be looking around going, this is not plan A, right? We didn't want to be slaves. That was not the plan, right? But they're slaves in a foreign country. They probably didn't pray for a boy because boys were being killed. So they probably prayed for a girl, and where they have a boy, right? Sometimes God gives you the exact opposite of what you pray for. And they find themselves in this horrible situation. And so what do you do when your plan, no longer sort of lines up with what is obviously God's plan? Well, what they did is they controlled what they could control, and then they surrendered what they couldn't control. And so they put Moses in that basket, and they set Moses in the Nile River, and they let him go. And I want you to think about that as a parent, how hard that must have been, how heartbreaking that must have been, to take your little baby, your child that you love. Can you imagine the tears and the drama that went into that moment, and put them in the river, and send that baby on down the river? But here's what happened. So Amram and Jochebed, Moses' parents, were faithful in the moment. And they learned if they're faithful in the moment, God will be faithful in the future. They send that baby down the river, and here's what happened. I'm not sure if they positioned that baby to go down the river so that this would happen, or if it just kind of randomly happened, but obviously I think God was all over all of this. Moses floats along in this little waterproofed basket, and eventually he floats past Pharaoh's daughter, who's bathing in the Nile. And she sees this basket. She sends a slave over to get the basket. Bring me that basket. They bring the basket to Pharaoh's daughter, who opens up and sees this little baby boy who's illegal. And she's moved. Her heart is moved. And what is it? The Bible says she reaches and she pulls Moses out. You know what the name Moses actually means? It means to lift out. That's exactly what Moses would do later with the Israelite people. He would lift them out. And so she lifts the baby, her heart's moved with compassion. She's like, this little boy needs to live. I'm going to raise this child. Now, this whole time, Miriam's been walking along, which is Moses' older sister, watching her little baby brother float along in the Nile. Miriam sees all this happen, and she speaks up, and she goes, hey, by the way, I happen to know a Hebrew woman who, is kind of like, at that time, if you know what I'm saying, who could breastfeed this child and be a nanny for you and help raise this child. Would you like me to go get her? Pharaoh's daughter's like, yeah, I would love that. That would be awesome. So can you imagine this conversation where Miriam goes back home and says, hey, Mom, Moses just floated in front of Pharaoh's daughter, who pulled him come out of the basket, whose heart just happened to be moved towards this child, who's decided this child is going to live and she's going to raise him, and then she basically wants to pay you to come and raise your own child as a nanny. You know how much it costs to raise kids today, people? How awesome would it be, right? God be like, I'm just going to pay you to raise your own. That's amazing, but they didn't know that was going to be the outcome. They came to uncertainty, and they said, we got to be faithful to do what we can do. What the king's telling us to do is morally wrong. We won't do it. We're going to be faithful to do what we can do, and then we're going to release what we can't control to God. God honored that. If you're faithful in the moment, God will be faithful in the future. So if you face uncertainty, one great principle is to let go of your need for control. In fact, I've got a basket here, as you've seen, and I wonder if there's some things in your own life that just kind of need to go in the basket, if you will, that you need to let go of. Some things that you can't control, but it's keeping you up at night, it's keeping you awake, it's filling you with anxiety and worry. You're walking around a nervous wreck over stuff that you have no influence over, right? Now, if you can control it, right? But if you can't control it, what's the point of worrying about it? You got to release it and let it go. In other words, you want to do what only you can do and trust God to do what only God can do. And once you know the difference, that's where peace is, right? It doesn't mean your life's perfect, but you can have a lot more peace than you have now because you're letting go of things you need to let go of. Some of you right now, you're holding on to fear related to your career in the future, and 10 years from now, and 20 years from now. I remember driving home when my daughter was born, and there was snow on the ground in Amarillo, Texas, and I'm sliding around, and I remember what was going through my mind right then. Someday, I'm going to have to pay for her college. Someday, she's going to get married. I'm going to have to pay for that wedding, right? And I remember the fear and the anxiety that just welled up within me, and I was worried about stuff at that point that I didn't need to be worried about. We had a long way to go. Of course, we slept, and now here we are. My daughter's going to college next year, so amazing. Get that scholarship. That's what I'm saying. But it's amazing. All those worries, all those fears, so many of those things have a way of just working themselves out. And all that unnecessary fear and worry that we carry leads to stress and worry. It strangles us. And it just buries us. You got to let some of that stuff go and give it back to God. Some of you right now, you're worried about your kids. I've said before, I used to think like when my kids were really little, that, man, this is the hardest, most challenging time because you have to do everything for them. And yes, it is challenging and difficult. You got young kids, your parents, it's a challenging season. But it's not like it ends, it just gets different, right? You might not have to change their diapers anymore, but they get older and they start going out on their own. Their happiness affects your happiness, right? What do they say? That you're only as happy as your least happy child. Right? You're connected to them. Moms, dads, your heart is with them. And I get that, but there's also a place where we got to realize we got to put our kids in the basket, just like Moses' parents put them in the basket. And after you've done all that you can do, you got to let them go. Release them to God. Some of you right now, you're in a situation like my family was in with me when I was a teenager in high school, caught up in addiction and doing a lot of destructive things. My father was a pretty tough guy. He was a master sergeant in the Army. He fought in World War II. He was a pretty tough guy. But I was the one later in his life that put him in counseling. And I asked him how he got through that season of me kind of when I was lost in addiction. And he said he finally came to a place where he realized that if he continued to carry my addiction and burden, it was going to destroy him, his marriage, and my brother and my 2 sisters. And it would destroy the whole family. It was up to him to surrender me to God and turn me over to God and focus on keeping our family together and growing as they could. And so he said, literally came to a place where he prayed, God, whether my son lives or dies, it's not my problem. That's your problem. I give him to you. I can't control him. Whether he comes home or he doesn't come home, that's not my problem anymore. I give that problem to you. Now I was of age. He'd done everything he could do. I understand, right? But there's a place where you got parents, you just gotta, it's a hard truth. But my dad said that was what led to freedom. Once he surrendered me to God, he let go of what he couldn't control. Then he was able to sort of restore his sanity to a place that he could ensure that I didn't destroy the rest of our family until I came back and came to my senses. And he said, eventually you did. But God taught me in that moment that you got to surrender even your kids back to him. Sometimes you got to let them go. I don't know what you need to put in the basket. But whatever that uncertainty is, whatever that thing is, Moses' parents remind us there's great power in doing what you can do and then letting go of that need to control everything and turning it over to God. Letting him handle it. Another principle, if you're facing uncertainty, is to move on from disappointment. Disappointment is something that we all face in our life. Moses is going to face some tremendous disappointment. In fact, when you look at the story, Moses is out. He's raised for 40 years in the Pharaoh's court. He's got all kinds of influence and power. People would have looked up to Moses. He would have been like the most eligible bachelor at court because he's single and a prince and all of that. He was probably raised also by his mom, who would have taught him the Hebrew language, would have taught him about God and faith in his life. So he's got these two worlds pulling on his heart. And when he gets to be about 40, it's time for him to choose. He's got to make a choice. Is he going to be a full-fledged, lifelong Egyptian, or is he going to be a Hebrew with the people of God who were slaves in Egypt at the time? And so Moses goes out and he sees this, he checks on his people, and he realizes the situation's horrible. Pharaoh's actually trying to press them down even more to basically wear them out with hard labor so that they won't continue to reproduce.